Right. So let me talk about the global economy by asking the question, just how hairy is the global situation? And judging from that photograph, quite hairy, quite hairy. Hairier than anyone would possibly want. That said, you might have heard an alternative narrative emerging. One suggesting that for the first time in roughly a decade, every major global economy is expanding, whether developing or developed. For the first time, meaning in 10 years, we have this global synchronicity. And the world is expanding together. Only about 6 nations around the world are in recession presently, and they tend to be quite small, these countries. The major economies are growing. Now, last year was a different story. Last year, the global economy expanded 3.2%. And just to put that into context, that was the worst year for global economic expansion since the financial crisis ended. So this has been a sloppy, choppy, erratic, sporadic global economic recovery. Last year was the worst year for that recovery, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. This year, the International Monetary Fund predicts that the global economy will expand 3.6%, and that, of course, is meaningfully better. Now, even that is not spectacular. During the 10 years that preceded the financial crisis, global growth averaged 4.2%, but 3.6% is better. I've cherry-picked some data here. I won't go through all of this, but the top half of the slide is the advanced economies of the world. It begins with a major label that says that, exactly that, advanced economies, and that group stretches from that major label down to the United States. And then the bulk of humanity resides in the emerging market and developing economies, and that group stretches from that major label down through Brazil. But if you can't see the slide, it won't disadvantage you, I don't think. So just to cherry pick some data here, there's 19 nations that use the euro as their primary currency, and the aggregate expect to grow, those European nations, 2.1% this year. That's better than last year, 1.8%, but still not fabulous. The third largest economy on the planet is Japan. Last year, Japan grew 1%. This year's forecast, 1.5%. That's better. Still not fabulous. The outlook for the Canadian economy is far improved. 3% growth expected this year, though, of course, nobody cares. And then the outlook for the Americans is 2.2%, but let's set that aside because we're going to talk a lot more about the U.S. economy as we go through the presentation. Now, if you look at the advanced world, if you could see it, you'd see that the top half of the slide, a lot of these growth rates are still around 2%. In some cases, France, even a little bit less than that. And so that's not particularly inspiring. Even America's forecast at 2.2% is not particularly inspiring for a nation that during the 25 years that preceded the financial crisis averaged 3.25% growth, but has not grown 3% in a single calendar year since 2005. But as lackluster as that appears, it's really been the emerging world that has posted the bulk of the disappointment in recent years. You might remember that a Goldman Sachs executive several years ago coined the term BRIC, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, and China, with the notion being that the so-called BRIC nations would supplant the United States as a leading engine of global economic growth. In fact, that has happened to a degree, but not nearly to the extent anticipated, and that's because many of those societies have posted deeply disappointing results, and the poster child for that disappointment is Brazil. Brazil, the giants of Latin America, Brazil home to the 9th largest economy on the planet. Last year, Brazil was in recession despite hosting the 2016 Summer Olympics and having to rebuild after the departure of Ryan Lochte. This year, that economy expected to grow only 0.7%. Russia, you don't expect much from the Russian economy. You expect very little from the Russian economy, and yet it's a BRIC nation. The notion several years ago was that Russia would be one of the most dynamic engines of global economic growth. Last year in recession, this year expected to grow a bit less than 2%. Improvement, largely because oil prices are higher this year, but we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. China, the forecast at 6.8% looks pretty benign, but if that comes to pass, that'll be the worst performance for the Chinese economy in roughly 3 decades. And then India, the outlook at 6.7%, that was actually downgraded recently because of issues related to the Indian currency and the imposition of a goods and services tax from the central government in New Delhi. So when you look at the world, don't get me wrong, it is better. It's better. But ask yourselves, why is it better? And I would argue that it's better because of policy. For instance, we're in this easy money, low interest rate, post-austerity environment. And it's really that supportive policy that has helped to lift global economic growth. But fundamentally, the global economy remains quite fragile. There's some structural factors, in other words, in place that will continue to impede global economic performance and serves, therefore, as a risk to us all in the form of a global economic meltdown. So what am I talking about? For instance, I'm talking about global demographics. So here I'm showing you the 16 most populous societies on the planet. I'm showing you 2017 population. I'm showing you 2050 population estimates. I'm showing you the delta between 2017 and 2050 anticipated. And then the sorting mechanism is the final column, expected percentage change in population between 2017 and 2050. At the top of the list is Nigeria. Nigeria in the year 2017 had a population of around 191 million people. By the year 2050, around 411 million people. That's a delta of 219.8 million Nigerians in 33 years. Now, what does that mean for global economic growth? Answer, perhaps not as much as we would like. Why? Because Nigeria today is a low output per capita society, which means that population growth does not neatly translate into output growth. And similar things could be said for other emerging societies with rapidly growing populations like Ethiopia, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Contrast that with some of the nations at the bottom of the list, like Germany. Germany in 2017 had a population of 82.1 million. By the year 2050, less than 80 million, a delta of 2.9 million. So effectively 3 million Germans disappear over the next 33 years. Japan, 127.5 million. Subtract 18.7 million from that, because effectively 19 million Japanese will disappear over the next 33 years. Now, what effect does that have on economic growth? Well, massive, of course, because these are very high output per capita societies. But that's not where the world's population is growing. The world's population tends to be growing in places where there are relatively few economic opportunities, relatively few. Now, as you come down the list, you will not see an advanced society expected to experience meaningful population growth until you get to the United States. By the year 2050, America expected to be home to 390 million people, around 325 million today. Now, we can add population in a couple of different ways. We can do it through immigration, of course, but as we know, immigration policy is subject to change. And we can also do it by having kids. And so here are fertility rates. The 15 highest fertility rates in the world are in the left-hand column. The 15 lowest fertility rates in the world are in the right-hand column. I've entitled the slide Niamey Vice because Niamey is the capital of Niger, much in the news recently. And in Niger, based on 2015 data, the average woman has 7.29 children, which means that if you're a Nigerian woman and you have 7 children, you are below average. Somewhat of an embarrassment, undoubtedly, to the village elders. You are not particularly prolific. Now, I'm perfectly well aware, and this is meant from a purely statistical perspective, that a child growing up in Mali, Chad, Uganda, Burundi, Somalia could end up curing cancer. I understand that. But these are low output per capita societies, but that's where the world's population is really growing quite profoundly. And again, contrast that with the column in the right, the lowest fertility rates. And I do not know what this says about the attractiveness or appeal of men from Hong Kong, but the average woman in Hong Kong only has 1.20 children. I'm not a physician, but my very strong sense is women from Hong Kong have a lot of headaches. And similar things can be said about women from Italy and Poland and Spain and Greece and Singapore. The Republic of Korea is, of course, South Korea. These are very high output per capita societies, but that is not where the world is having its babies. Now, America is not in either column. Our fertility rate is around 1.9, which means, by the way, that to grow population, we have to have immigration, as it turns out. Any forecast that you see that suggests that America is growing in terms of population, or at least will, suggest that we have positive net international migration. Now, that's not where the structural factors end. The demographics of the world are weak, at least from the perspective of output growth. But on top of that, the world is deeply indebted. So you might remember the report that came out last summer from the International Monetary Fund indicating that based on 2015 data, total global indebtedness was $152 trillion, that equaled 225% of annual global output, that by the year 2015 we had easily more than twice as much debt globally as we did in the year 2000, despite the deleveraging that took place during the financial crisis, that 2/3 of that debt is owed by the global private sector, including heavily indebted private sectors in Europe, China, Japan. And why do I bring all this up? Because this sets the stage for a vicious feedback loop in which that slow or fragile global economic growth hampers the deleveraging process, and the consequent debt overhang exacerbates the slowdown. In other words, in a soft global economic environment, albeit improving, but a soft global economic environment, companies are only able to, on average, generate so much revenue growth. But much of that revenue is being devoted toward debt service, as opposed to investments in human or physical capital, and of course, that's what drives growth. But this is based on 2015 data. You might ask the question, Anirban, well, what about 2016 data? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Because the International Institute of Finance did a report based on 2016 data. And they find that total global indebtedness is now $215 trillion, or 325% of annual global output. And again, why do I bring all of this up? Well, as the International Monetary Fund and others have warned, the sheer size of this debt could set the stage for an unprecedented private deleveraging process that could threaten the fragile global economic recovery. Meaning what? Unprecedented. What does that mean? It means worse than the last time. Well, the last time was pretty bad. But the world has more debt now than it did back then. And the demographics have not improved. And immigration policies become messier in the advanced world. And so you put all of that together, and there's still some structural factors that will continue to impede global economic progress. So again, I'm not arguing with any economist who suggests that 2017 globally has been better than 2016 was, or that 2018 will be better. Because 2018 is shaping out to be pretty decent for the global economy. So now, let's talk about that. So it's still a fragile economic environment. We see this in many different ways. As an example, there are certain commodities that almost all of humanity, at least in the advanced world, utilizes, things like oil. So oil, as I get up this evening, is trading at around $57 a barrel. And some of you will point out to me, Anirban, oil prices have risen recently, and that's correct. Part of that is due to the gyrations taking place within a single Saudi family, which happens to be a quite large family. Part of that is because of an agreement reached by OPEC roughly a year ago to truncate oil production, particularly from Saudi Arabia and Iran, to try to raise prices. Part of that is due to the fact that the global economy is a bit stronger this year. But at $57 a barrel this evening, it should be noted that oil prices are a little bit more than half of what they were during the early summer of 2014 when they stood at $107 a barrel, and a little bit more than a third of where they were during the early summer of 2008 when they were at $147 a barrel. In other words, yeah, the global economy is better. It's still fragile, and it's hardly a fabulous performer. And these relatively low commodity prices are true across the commodity complex. If I were to show you metal price indices, which I'm showing you here, so you see the red line bobbing and weaving through the slide, that's the index price for iron ore. Iron ore prices have collapsed over time. What does iron ore go into? Ships, buildings, automobiles, trucks? Global economy can't be that strong if iron ore prices are so weak. Base metals, that's your aluminum, zinc, nickel, copper. Copper, as I get up here today, is trading at $3.10 per pound. Those of you who follow that price know that several years ago, $3.75 per pound. Natural gas is not on this chart. It's not a metal, but natural gas is trading tonight at $3.16 per million BTU. You'll remember several years ago, natural gas was at $5 per million BTU. Corn several years ago was trading at $8 a bushel. Today, $3.49. And so, again, now, this is one of the reasons, in fact, the primary reason that 2016 was so weak for the global economy. Bless you, those low prices hurt the producers of iron ore, natural gas, corn, soybeans, wheat, oil. But it also created opportunities for others. Who? Buyers. Sellers do not seem to have an appreciation for low prices. Buyers adore them. Huh? You don't go to Walmart for the experience, do you? Do you? You might, I don't know. But buyers love low prices. I know this much. And there's opportunity here for people who use, let's say food processors who buy corn as an input, or chemical producers who use natural gas as an input to buy low, go through the respective value-added processes, and then sell high. And that's the secret of capitalism, I have to tell you. I've spoken here, 14, 15 years now? Each presentation more complicated than the last? But it's actually very simple, isn't it, Chamber of Commerce stakeholders? Isn't it simple? Buy low, sell high. That's it. I mean, let me assure you, business people of Washington County, that formula will never steer you wrong. Buy low, sell high. If you do that enough times, you can run for president as a Republican. So the question becomes, are the producers of the world, those who use these commodities as inputs, taking advantage of these low prices? And we know they're not. How do we know? Because natural gas is stuck around $3 per million BTU, and copper is stuck around $3 per pound, and oil is still below $60 a barrel, and corn is stuck below $3.50 per bushel. But we also have leading indicators The one I showed you last year, for instance, the Baltic Dry Index. Now, the Baltic Dry Index is a reflection of shipping prices of raw materials, metals, grains, and fossil fuels. And what we began to see in 2016 was that shipping charges started to rise. And that's evidence that producers around the world are purchasing more inputs, which ultimately translates into more outputs. And that's the precursor to the improvement that we've seen globally in 2017. And if you look at the Baltic Dry Index here, you'll still see that it's rising. It's still rising, and that means that 2018 is shaping out to be pretty decent, which is why the International Monetary Fund predicts that next year, the global economy will expand 3.8%. But again, if you look at it from the perspective of time, shipping charges are far cheaper than they used to be. And the global economy continues to be fragile and not fully recovered, and very much in debt. So what does this all mean for the US economy? Well, we turn to that now by engaging in some commercial situation investigation. This is an older photograph. Perhaps you can see me there to the right. It is what I used to look like when I began speaking for this chamber. As you know, we've completed 100 months of economic expansion now. Recession ended in June of 2009. We're now in November of 2017, so 100 months plus. It is the third longest recovery in American history. Typically, when we look at recoveries, the variable we look at most carefully or closely is gross domestic product. Here I'm also showing you the most recent data on GDP. We just got the third quarter GDP number. It's a preliminary estimate, but the government is suggesting that during the third quarter, the US economy expanded 3% on an annualized basis, after expanding 3.1% during the prior quarter, the second quarter of 2017. US economy has picked up some steam. Now, we saw something very similar, by the way, in 2014. And, we've had good quarters before. But 2 good quarters is quite rare for this cycle. And this now is the fourth quarter. And my very strong sense is, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, the fourth quarter will also be a good one for the US economy. Which means that, if I'm correct about that, we'll have had 3 consecutive good quarters in America. Quite a rarity during this sporadic, erratic economic growth cycle. Now, at the heart of what has been driving this economy forward, as you know, is consumer spending. That's where the magic has been. You might have seen recently that consumer confidence recently rose to a 17-year high. Not coincidentally, unemployment is down to a 17-year low. There are a lot of jobs being created out there right now. We just got the jobs report for October last week. Another 261,000 net new jobs added in October. September was revised upward into positive territory from a negative 33,000 to a positive 18,000, which means that the last month that we lost jobs in America was September of 2010. We've added jobs every month since then, whether hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever has happened, we've continued to add jobs. We've added over the past 12 months 2.004 million, yep, there we go. I had it and I lost it. There it is. 2.004 million jobs. These horizontal bars represent the number of jobs added by each of these sectors between October of 2016 and October of 2017. Every sector has added jobs, save one, and that sector is known as information. And you say, Anirban, impossible. Impossible that would be the case. Information is the fastest growing sector of the US economy, Anirban. Not the only one to have lost jobs. This is merely statistical artifice. This is a function of how companies are categorized. So Google sells advertising, so they're a professional services firm. You can see professional services at the top of the list there. Amazon is a supply chain manager, so they're in the trade, transportation, and utilities category. And Tesla and Apple, of course, are manufacturers. Information includes folks who work for newspapers, radio stations, magazines, the 100 people who lost their jobs at ESPN 3 months ago, the people who work for the City Paper, which is shutting down after 4 decades of operation in Baltimore. They're part of that category as well. So a lot of disintermediation in media, and so this result prevails. But for the most part, a lot of good news. And yet, we economists, if we say that, well, we've added 2 million jobs over the past 12 months, unemployment is a 17-year low, that's when people have a tendency to throw figurative tomatoes in our direction. Because they know those kinds of statistics, those statistics exclude a lot of pertinent information. So how, on the one hand, do we have so much job creation? How, on the one hand, do we have 6.08 million job openings right now, unfilled jobs? And yet we have, at the same time, so much idleness in America. And this statistic gets at that part of the labor market story, idleness. This is the employment to population ratio. It's exactly what it looks like. It's the number of jobs in the economy divided by adult population. Look how gradual the recovery has been. Look how incomplete the recovery has been. Employment to population ratio in our country is far lower now than it was in the year 2001. Well, that was a recession year. We're in the 9th year of economic recovery, and employment to population is still far below where it was in 2001, a recession year, happened to also be the year of 9/11. It's remarkable. And a related statistic, the labor force participation rate, which is around 63% in our country, is just a few tenths of a percentage point above a 40-year low. And what does that statistic tell us? That not only are not a lot of people not working, they're not even looking for work. Now, some of you will remind me that one of the reasons for this is the retirement of baby boomers in larger numbers. Dow Jones closed today at over 23,500. NASDAQ is chasing 6,800. S&P is chasing 2,600. Home prices are now rising, including in Washington County. I'll show you data on that in a moment. So more baby boomers are taking the opportunity to retire voluntarily. And what effect does that have on this statistic? Well, they disappear from the numerator. They're no longer employed. But they're still in the denominator. They're still part of the adult population. So when a baby boomer retires, it suppresses this statistic. And if that was the only explanatory factor, I'd say, well, that's great news. But it is not. Because one of the other factors is historically low labor force participation rates among young American men. Bless you again. And you might have read the article that came out July 13th in the Wall Street Journal indicating that one of the factors that has kept young men out of the labor market, one of the factors that explains between 23 and 46% of the reduction in young male working hours in recent years is the continuous play of video games. That there is an army of young men out there who play video games all day, every day. And that based on research from Princeton University and the University of Rochester, that might explain up to 46% of the recent reduction in working hours among young American men. Now, you say, Anirban, there's an army of young men playing video games all day? Where are they? You never see them, that's the point. You say, Anirban. So if they're playing video games all day, that's a very unsatisfactory existence. They call it an immersive digital lifestyle. So you might say, this immersive digital lifestyle must be very unsatisfying. The research indicates that young men who play video games all day are far happier than young men who work for a living. These video games are awesome. These invaders look like invaders. And then you say, well, Anirban, but there's an economic reality to this. These men are in their 20s. They have to support themselves. I mean, there's food and other things. I mean, how do they take care of themselves? Parents. Parents are the leading source of support for this lifestyle. So there has been some shift in social norms, and that has affected the data. And so we have a lower labor force participation rate, employment to population ratio, and that's one of the reasons that we have 6.08 million unfilled jobs. And construction firms here will tell me, many of them, I can't find electricians, I can't find heating and air conditioning professionals, I can't find welders. Manufacturers will tell me I can't find machinists. Trucking firms will tell me I can't find truck drivers. Everyone knows that, but they also don't realize that we can't find mechanics either. And those folks come home every night, so what's the excuse there? Part of that is U.S. educational system and the underinvestment in vocational training, which we don't call it even vocational education anymore. It's just it's a pejorative. So we call it career and technical education, so no one knows what you're really trying to say. But it's preparing people in the 11th and 12th grade for actual careers. It is absolutely true that a college education, a four-year degree, has been a pathway to prosperity for many Americans. That is true. That is true. That is not false. But it's not the pathway for everybody. And we've got, of course, a one-size-fits-all mentality, this high-stakes testing that we've introduced into our schools. Why? Because 20 years ago, on the Trends in International Math and Science Study and other tests, American kids scored at the bottom of advanced nations. So we said, we got to have more testing. These kids have to do better on these tests. Do you know how you teach kids how to do well on tests? You tell them the questions. You show them last year's test, and you give them the answers. But what do you teach them? Exactly. You don't teach them how to learn, which is really what employers want. Because 70% of all jobs have, as their primary skill, a skill that's learned on the job. So you want them to be able to learn. So there's a lot wrong here. But if the question is, can an American who's earnestly looking for work find a job in America, the answer probably is yes. A lot of job openings right now. And if they can pass a drug test, my goodness, sky is the limit. So I must tell you that even that is not required. Even that is not required. Yes. Can you pass one? Yeah, okay. There are certain occupational categories in construction, manufacturing, trucking. They have to take a drug test. They must pass it. We understand that. They're working with heavy equipment. It's for their own safety and safety of others. But there are some occupational categories where drug tests are now not required. So I'll give you an example. Several weeks ago, before the storms, as it turns out, I was on a panel in Houston, Texas. It was a tourism conference, and one of my co-panelists was the head of global catering services at Hilton Worldwide. A person who'd been in the industry for many years, a woman who that night actually received an award for her service to the industry. And during lunch, prior to the panel, we were talking about the staffing model at Hilton Worldwide, and she said, you know, we've changed at Hilton. So it is possible now at Hilton to be a customer-facing worker, customer-facing employee, and have visible tattoos, to have visible piercings, mine are hidden, well hidden, and you don't have to take a drug test. And I said, you know, that's interesting. Why are you, and by the way, I'm like silver elite there, so I felt empowered to ask the question, why are you doing this? And she said, well, we want our staff to look like our customers. And I said, you know what? I've stayed at Hilton's before. I'm silver elite. And most of the customers don't look like that, I got to tell you. I mean, they might do some coke during the merger discussions, but otherwise they're pretty clean, you know. So my feeling is, as an economist, I'm speculating, why is this happening? And I think it's happening because Hilton has massive turnover, along with other service delivering organizations. They're trying to increase retention, reduce turnover, and they're reaching out to a population that has fewer outside opportunities, fewer opportunities to leave. People with visible tattoos, visible piercings, so on and so forth. And so, yes, not all is right with the labor market, but there's a lot of jobs out there. And, you know, one of the places in which there's a lot of jobs is the state of Maryland. You would have to go back to the late 1990s to see this pace of job growth in Maryland. Our state has added more than 64,000 net new jobs over the past 12 months for which we have data. The 12 months ended September of 2017. We've added jobs at twice the pace of the balance of the country over the last 12 months. 2.4% job growth versus 1.2%, though that again is statistical artifice to a certain extent because we had storms in Texas and in Florida, and so that suppressed the percentage job growth in other parts of the country. So again, comparison is somewhat flawed. Nonetheless, easily outperformed the nation. Job growth in every category save one. That category happened to be information. Now, Hagerstown, this metropolitan area, the Hagerstown-Martinsburg metropolitan area, was not part of that story, as it turns out, at least according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Because according to their data, between September of 2016 and September 2017, this region lost about 300 jobs. And many of you that I was interviewing surreptitiously before I got up here have told me the economy around here is a little bit flat. Not terrible, just a little flat. But it's not flat in Prince George's County, it's booming in Prince George's County. It's booming in Montgomery County, and you see what's happening in Frederick. You can see what's happening in downtown Columbia, downtown Towson, Owings Mills, White Marsh. And so there is some dynamism there, College Park, and all those Prince George's County markets, National Harbor. And so that is the story here. This is Metropolitan Statistical Area employment growth over time for Hagerstown-Martinsburg. So there was a period, you can see here, the pre-recession period, circa 2005, 2006, a lot of job growth, housing markets red hot. Remember all those people who work in Montgomery County moving to the Hagerstown metropolitan area and moving to Washington County and say, yeah, I want more square footage, I'll take the 1.5-hour commute. Housing market collapses, oil prices rise to $147 a barrel, collapse. The job loss in 2008, 2009. And then the recovery. Consumers coming back, stimulus package, lots of job growth. But then you can see the momentum sort of peters out thereafter. And so here we are right now with sort of an ongoing and incomplete jobs recovery in the Hagerstown-Martinsburg metropolitan area. Now, again, the Maryland story is very different. 50 states, District of Columbia. Where has Maryland ranked in terms of percentage job growth over the past 12 months? Third in the country. And that is remarkable. Do you know why? That's remarkable for many reasons. Number one, the last time we were third, we were one of 13 colonies. But what's more remarkable is this. There's only 2 states that rank ahead of us, Nevada and Utah, and just by a tenth of a percentage point. So we're right there. Statistically insignificantly different from number 1. But imagine if Utah's largest city, which happens to be Salt Lake City, produced 350 homicides in a single year. How that would affect their job growth. Our leading city did that, or is about to do that this year. The city's already over 300 homicides. 3rd year in a row of over 300 homicides. And despite the fact, and we only have one big city. Everything else is around 60,000 people. Rockville, Frederick, Bowie, so on and so forth. Gaithersburg. Columbia has over 100,000 people, or of course not an incorporated municipality, but it's a community of 100,000 people. But the point is, Baltimore City is over 600,000 people. That's our only big city. And it is struggling. And despite that, Maryland ranks 3rd in the country. And it gives you some sense of how strong some of these suburban economies are. And we'll talk more about the strength of suburban economies late in the presentation. Now, there are some states that are not adding jobs. They're in the bottom of that 3rd column. So there's some stories there. West Virginia and Wyoming are our 2 most coal mining intensive states. The 2 most coal mining intensive states in the country. Kansas, toward the bottom there, is heavily engaged in agricultural production. They've been hit hard by the decline in corn prices, soybean prices, other prices. Alaska is a major oil and natural gas producer. Illinois has sent 4 of its last 7 governors to prison. And then Connecticut. Connecticut is a cautionary tale because, of course, Connecticut is a very wealthy state, but it's also a very high-tax state, highly regulated state. And they've driven the headquarters of General Electric out to Boston. They've driven out the headquarters of Aetna from Hartford to New York. Bristol-Myers Squibb has departed, basically, the state. Hedge fund managers from Stanford and Greenwich have left the state in large numbers. So the state is having a devil of a time balancing its budget, has one of the most underfunded pensions in the country. It's got a problem. Hartford, by the way, increasingly is talking about declaring bankruptcy. And so, cautionary tale, because we in Maryland have a tendency to tax people heavily and to export a lot of wealth in the process. And so we have to obviously think about that as we move forward as a state. But the fact of the matter is the last year has been quite good for Maryland. This is unemployment rates for the 24 large metropolitan areas in our country. Unemployment rates, not employment, but unemployment rates. Unemployment rates are low almost everywhere, including in Washington and Baltimore. And that suggests that wage pressures will continue to build. This is Maryland County unemployment rates, Washington County at 3.8%. So by that measure, Washington County looks great. But I would say that the reason that unemployment has continued to fall in Washington County over time, you can see that on this chart, this nice steady decline in unemployment, is not because of job growth in Washington County. It's because of job growth around Washington County, which of course helps explain why sort of those commuting times are starting to build back up again since the Great Recession. So let's talk now about real estate, huh? Next part of the presentation. And I'm introducing this part of the presentation, the real estate and construction part of the presentation, with this television show. Because this television show included the word street. And that seems appropriate for real estate and construction. But that is not the only reason I'm doing this. I don't want you to think that it is. America's produced many great television shows. And if we were to rank the greatest television shows in American history, which is the same as ranking the greatest television shows in worldwide history, we would put at the very top of our list, many of us, MASH. Many of us would agree that MASH is the greatest television show in American, meaning global, history. And that Alan Alda is the greatest television actor in American, meaning worldwide history, though I myself am partial to Bill Bixby, who started in My Favorite Martian, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, and of course, The Incredible Hulk. But I digress, at least arguably. The second greatest show in American history, it's right here, right there, 21 Jump Street, right there. And why can I say that with such assertiveness? Such confidence that I am in fact correct? Well, my goodness, look who's standing in the middle there. That is damn near perfect right there. Now, what has been the most distinctive characteristic of this economic recovery? Well, that's an easy one. As I say, we're neatly in the 9th year of economic recovery, and one of the things that you typically see as an economic expansion matures is that money gets more expensive, meaning interest rates rise. But if you look at key US interest rates, like, for instance, mortgage rates. Here I'm showing you the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue and the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in red. For the most part, interest rates have been falling throughout this cycle. They're cheaper now than when the recession ended. I mean, it's amazing. Money's become cheaper. Now, some exceptions here. If you look at the chart closely, you'll see that there is an increase in interest rates during the summer of 2013. That's a so-called taper tantrum. That's the Federal Reserve announcing that it's going to wind down its quantitative easing program. And the notion in the bond markets was, oh, okay, they're going to create less money supply, so liquidity is going to dry up a bit, money's going to become more expensive, more rare and more expensive, and so interest rates rose, and then the market realized, no, there's still lots of money floating around, and interest rates start to edge lower, until when? November 2016, a year ago. Because it was a year ago precisely that the 45th President of the United States is elected, Donald J. Trump. And the notion was that this pro-business agenda in Washington, D.C., coming to Washington, D.C., at the most well-attended inauguration in American history, that the notion was that we were going to get tax cuts, corporate level, personal income tax simplification, trillion-dollar infrastructure-led stimulus package, financed heavily with public-private partnerships, and deregulation of energy and banking, among other segments of the economy. And that the U.S. economy was going to grow faster, and because of that, there'd be more inflation. Interest rates, as a result, rise when there's more inflation. And you can see that November of 2016. And then the market says, you know what, not that much has changed. Over the course of months, you know what, since the recession ended in June of 2009, average U.S. economic growth has been 2.2% per annum. What's the forecast for the current year? 2.2%. How much has changed? And interest rates have been falling basically ever since. And you might have thought that after more than 8 years of economic recovery, having created 16 million jobs as a country, having driven unemployment to a 17-year low, looking at consumer confidence at a 17-year high, that more Americans would have jumped into home ownership. But as you know, we are more of a renter society. Home ownership ended the most recent quarter for which we have data at 63.9%. To see home ownership rates still this low, you'd have to go back to the 1980s, and before that, the 1960s. In fact, during the second quarter of last year, home ownership hit a 51-year low in America. It's very much affected what's been built. This is U.S. private new multifamily construction. It's apartments plus condominiums under construction. Toward the middle of the slide, you see a peak there. That's mostly condominiums. That's pre-recession, pre-financial crisis. That's when people wanted to own property. Because the more you owned, the more wealth you gained. And then the collapse. And then the recovery in private new multifamily construction, that's mostly apartments, of course. And you know it's apartments, because if it had not been apartments, home ownership would not have cratered to a 51-year low during the second quarter of last year. But you can also see what's being built, including in, let's say, downtown Baltimore. And you ask yourselves, how can this be? Where are all these renters coming from? They're building a 44-story apartment building in downtown Baltimore, 414 Light Street. Fantastic, beautiful building. Lots of apartments. One bedroom, $3,000. People say to me all the time, I say, home ownership is about to come back in this country with a vengeance. Home ownership is about to come back in this country with a vengeance. It means a lot to Washington County. We'll talk about that in a moment. But people say, why do you say that, Anibal? You're wrong about that. Are you saying these millennials are going to move out of their city apartments and move into suburban homes? That's exactly what I'm saying. Why, Anibal? Passage of time. Most common age in this country this year is 25. 25-year-olds like city apartments. It's said that these young people, these millennials, like to be able to walk to restaurants, be able to walk to bars, be able to walk to museums. How many times do you need to see a museum? Once a year is plenty. It's too much, in fact. It's too much. And once you have kids, which they will have in large numbers in 5 to 10 years, you don't want to live in a city apartment anymore, do you? You want to live in a nice suburban home, backyard, great school system. And that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed going forward, particularly given the fact that home prices are rising. And the investment motivation is returning to housing. And that makes Washington County more of a value proposition. Because through it all, the school system is held up. Its reputation is high. It's solid statewide. There's been a lot of good superintendents in this county over time. It's made a difference. Home prices are rising. 25-year-olds are steadily turning into 30-year-olds and 35-year-olds. And this is happening after a period during which we didn't build many single-family homes. This is U.S. single-family housing starts. And this is an opportunity particularly, and I understand that there is one city in this county and 8 towns. I understand. So I don't want to just fixate on Hagerstown, but there is a gigantic opportunity in downtown Hagerstown to make that a recipient of young families. And when you put the arts and what's happening around the arts together with that story, it could be really quite smashing. It could be Washington County's Frederick. And isn't that what people around here have been aspiring toward? Isn't that what everyone aspires to be, Frederick? Does not the entire world aspire to be Frederick, Maryland? The answer is yes, they do. Everyone wants to be Frederick, Maryland. Paris wants to be Frederick, Maryland. Cumberland wants to be Frederick, Maryland. Everyone wants. Huh? Well, what was the dynamic? What is the demographic that drove that? Young professionals coming up I-270, saying, we can't afford Montgomery County, and we love Frederick. And something similar can happen here in Hagerstown, Washington County. It won't happen immediately, but 5 to 10 years, and a lot of things are coming together, aligning neatly. And you can actually see some of this already. This is Washington County housing unit sales. You can see home sales have been rising over time. The trend line I've imposed there in that black line, but you can see it's very solid. There are more people interested in owning property in Washington County. They say people vote with their feet. Well, they're voting into Washington County. They want to own. And if you look at building permits here, so I'm looking at September, year-to-date September 2016 versus September 2017. So I'm comparing the first 9 months of 2016 versus the first 9 months of 2017. The red bars there, the red bars are single-family building permits in the Hagerstown metropolitan area. And you can see it's up. It's up. And builders are starting to realize, you know what, there's more opportunities to develop here because more people want to live here owning a home. So that will be a big story. Now, penultimate part of this presentation. I want to start talking about the forecast. Hitting the home stretch. I know it's late. Thank you for sticking with me. I'm getting there. This slide focuses upon non-residential construction. And I fully appreciate that a lot of people here don't have any interest in non-residential construction. In fact, many people here probably would say, Anirban, do whatever you want up there, just don't talk about non-residential construction. I could not handle that at 8 p.m. And that's exactly what I'm doing, unfortunately. But I'm doing it for a reason, not to punish you, but to try to give you some sense of some of the dynamics I see in the economy that will shape how this economy is going to perform going forward. So as it turns out, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. All of them are shown on this slide. These horizontal bars represent the percentage change in construction spending for each of these 16 categories over the past 3 years. 3 years stretching from September 2014 to September 2017. Now, you'll see that some of the categories have seen increased investment and some a decreased investment. Let's focus on the decrease, the worst performers. At the very bottom, a category called sewage and waste disposal. That is a basic municipal function of taking trash out of neighborhoods, out of commercial districts, and doing something with it. That construction-related investment. That's down 18% in 3 years. Let's call it negative 6% per year for 3 years. Above that is water supply. I had thought that more communities would be investing in their water supply, if for no other reason than to reduce liability after Flint, Michigan. But no, that's down 17% in 3 years. Public safety. That includes your police stations and fire stations, construction of those. That's down double digits in 3 years. Religious, above that. That's your construction of churches, temples, synagogues, mosques. That's down around 11%, 11.5% in 3 years. God is down an 11.5% in 3 years. God is down. Huh? Should be back by April. Then above that is a category called conservation development. Conservation development is dams and levees. These are largely Army Corps of Engineers projects. This is flood control. Apparently, we do not have flooding issues in America because we've been investing much less in flood control over the past 3 years. Why do I bring this all up? The point is, a lot of these are publicly financed categories, infrastructure categories. If you thought America was underinvesting in infrastructure a few years ago, we're investing much less now. And then we ask ourselves, why are we not growing 3% like we used to? How come we can't get there? It's very simple. Not enough of us work, and we don't invest enough in the people that do. The people who do work, by the way, work very hard. Americans who work very hard by global standards. In any given year, 11% of American workers don't take a vacation. And a quarter of those don't take a vacation because they're too guilty to take one. They don't want to leave their colleagues behind. That's who we are. But a lot of us do not work. Not enough to pull the rope, and we don't have enough rope to pull because we underinvest in our infrastructure. Now, that said, there's some construction categories where we've seen some real growth. At the very top of the list is lodging. That's hotel room construction for the most part. That's up 70% in 3 years. Do we really need that many hotel rooms in this country? It actually is a response to flooding, if you think about it, but not the optimal one. Office space. Do we need more office space? Up 40% in 3 years. Is that the problem? We don't have enough office space? Except every major metropolitan area you go to, including the Washington metropolitan area, where as of 2015 they had 70 million square feet of vacant office space, has plenty of office space. Now, I know that the vacant office space is often Class B and Class C office space, and it does not compete with the Class A and Class A plus space under construction. But nonetheless, we have plenty of office space, so why do we see this result? That in a 2% growth environment, we see 7% growth in lodging-related construction in 3 years and 40% in office. My feeling is the tail wagging the dog. And it gets back to the early stages of the presentation. Ask yourselves, in this fragile global economic environment, where else is a foreign investor going to put their money? Slow growth Europe? England post-Brexit? Even slow growth Japan? Wobbly societies like Russia, Brazil, Venezuela, Turkey, South Africa now in recession? Maybe some of their capital goes there. But a lot of global capital comes to America in search of a combination of yield and safety. But when it comes to America, it says, my goodness, I don't get anything in the bond market. 10-year Treasury today is yielding 2.31%. Strip out inflation, it's almost zero. And then the stock market, my goodness, Dow Jones at 23,500 and change looks pricey to me. So maybe if I invest in America, I'll put at least some of my money into commercial real estate. And that's what we have seen. This is offshore investment into commercial and multifamily categories. What is this? This is foreigners buying our office buildings, hotels, shopping centers, apartment buildings. Look what's happened in 2015, 2016, the last two bars here. That offshore investment has surged. Not because the US economy was booming, but because what else was that money going to do in this fragile economic environment? What is the economic effect of this? New buyer in town. Raises the value of office buildings, raises the value of hotels, and that's a signal to the developer community, scarcity, let me build more space. But is there really demand for all that space, or is it financial illusion? I'll give you an example of how this works out. I delivered a presentation recently to a group of commercial real estate developers at a Maggiano's restaurant in Tysons Corner, Virginia. Prominent Washington, D.C. area developers. And after my speech, a gentleman came up to me, a gentleman known to all in the room, a very prominent developer, and he said to me, Anirban, because that's my name. Anirban, I just delivered an apartment building on U Street in the District of Columbia, and then I sold it for a 4 cap, and then he winks at me. And that happened. He winked at me. And the wink, as it turns out, came a bit after the statement, so it might simply have been, hey, are you free this afternoon? Which I totally was, and every evening. But if the wink pertained to the statement previously made, what was he saying? He's saying, Anirban, I developed an apartment building on U Street. U Street has changed a lot over the years. And I sold it for a 4 cap. What does that mean? Market capitalization rate equals 4. So you take 100 divided by 4, you'll get 25. So he sold that building for 25 times the net income of the building. It's a fairly large multiple. It's a massive multiple. So what was he saying to me? And sometimes you'll see apartment buildings selling at a cap rate of 1 or 2 subparts. So the multiple is just enormous. So what is he saying? Anirban, I delivered this apartment building on U Street, not a big deal, but I made a ton of money on the deal. But you know what? Wink, my buyer might have a problem. And that's what's happening. People are chasing a lot of assets. They're paying a lot. And remember, this is the time, the moment in an economic expansion cycle that feels best. Do you remember 1999? You remember 1999. It was a good year. We partied like it was 1999 in 1999 because, Prince said so, but also that was a year that the dot-com bubble got even bigger. And it feels so good when the bubbles are getting bigger. You remember 2005? Same thing. Housing bubble was getting bigger. Felt great. But by 2006, we saw the housing bubble was bursting. By 2007, in recession. By 2000, dot-com bubble is bursting. 2001, we're in recession. And I tell you, this period, 2017 going to 2018, feels a lot like that period. It feels good. But it's hard to justify some of these asset prices. Now, in terms of real estate bubbles, it is not the case that the foreign investor invests equally across the countryside. There are certain markets with which they are particularly enamored. At the right panel, you'll see where a lot of office investment activity took place during the first 3 quarters of last year. One market absorbed 45.5% of all that foreign investment. One market in the whole entire country. A market so great they named it twice New York. But other tier 1 markets, San Francisco, Boston, Washington, D.C., that's, I think, where some of these excess real estate valuations are occurring, meaning bubbles or at least mini bubbles. And that takes me to the forecast. We are down to the wire. Now, the Wire's television show that featured my town, Baltimore, not in its brightest light, but it was a great television show. So a couple of things to note. One, the consumer is spending. Now, it is true that the millennials are different from us in many different ways. One of them is, I'm stereotyping here, but it seems to be borne out by the data, they prefer experiences to the accumulation of material possessions. So they'd rather spend on travel, for instance, than on acquiring a car. Remember when we were growing up what we wanted? What did we want more than anything else? Trans Am. We wanted a Trans Am or a Firebird, and if we could get a Corvette, my goodness. Heaven. These kids don't care. They can't even drive. So they're but even with that, retail sales are 4.4% year over year. And of course, one of the big winners is the internet. It happens to be third on that in terms of percentage growth, and that's Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And Jeff Bezos just become the richest person on the planet, $90 billion, $90 billion. And he's 53 years old. He's a kid. And he made most of his $90 billion selling to Americans. Well, we're less than 5% of the world's population. He's increased selling to the other 95%. His global supply chain becomes more exquisite, more elaborate, more global each and every passing day. And so 4 weeks ago, Toys R Us, a retailer of whom we were very fond growing up, went bankrupt. 24th major retail bankruptcy. So we see a lot of store closings. But don't mistake that for thinking that the consumer is not spending. They're spending, it's just that a lot of that growth is online. And so bookstores and other stores we see closing. Baltimore got rocked yesterday because it was announced that the Target at Mondawmin Mall is going to close. And that's very bad for West Baltimore. That's the only department store in West Baltimore. And so that's happening. But a lot of this is because the consumer is spending differently than they once did. And because they are spending, the US savings rate is now back down to 3.1%. So a few years ago, the discussion was what? Americans are deleveraging. They're saving money. They're paying down their debt. Though, of course, as you know, a lot of that deleveraging was simply banks saying, oh, this debt is uncollectible, we're writing it off. But set that aside, the point is, yeah, it's great now the consumer is spending. It's good for the economy right now. 2 consecutive good quarters. A third is coming. But that sets the stage for something worse to come because consumers are overdoing it in some instances. Student debt, of course, is now $1.3 trillion outstanding. Last year was a record for new vehicle sales in this country. You know why? Because so many people took on auto loans. And you know why they could? Because the fast-growing segment of auto lending last year was what? Subprime. Auto loans made to people with poor credit scores. That's how they expanded the market. So that will last for a while, but it can't last forever. The wild card, of course, is business investment, and that continues to be so-so. And so the consumer continues to drive the ship. And that brings me to my final slide, the closer. This is my final slide, where I sum up. Now, The Closer is a television show that aired from 2005 to 2012, and it starred Kyra Sedgwick as Brenda Lee Johnson. And I mean no offense here to man or woman, but that was quite a show, and she is quite a woman. Quite a woman. And I learned recently, however, that she is married to the American actor Kevin Bacon. And it was shortly thereafter that I decided to end my pursuit of her. That said, I was once in a restaurant in Annapolis, Maryland with Kevin Bacon. I was with him. I knew he was there. He didn't realize I was there. But I was there with him. And so I consider that 1 degree of separation. So just a review here. So the global economy remains weak, and correspondingly, global capital has continued to flow into America. And that helps explain these massively high stock prices, these incredibly high commercial real estate valuations, which again feels great in the short term, but leaves us vulnerable, because money can move in, but money can also flow out pretty quickly. And I'm starting to see some indications of mini bubbles forming in commercial real estate, particularly in office, lodging, and multifamily segments. Now, what would cause bubbles to burst? Well, often there's a triggering event. Failure of Lehman Brothers. Poor dot-com earnings, first quarter of 2000. One of the factors that clearly is at work is that inflationary pressures are building. You don't see it in the statistics necessarily. You know, the Federal Reserve likes to use its core PCE deflator as their principal measure of inflation, and that suggests that inflation is really not running that hot. But isn't life becoming more expensive faster? When you think about wages growing faster, when you think about healthcare costs growing faster, tuition's growing faster, rent's growing faster, home prices now rising, softwood lumber prices rising. You look all around you, inflation is building up. I think in 2018 it'll start showing up in the data. And my very strong belief is that will start to edge interest rates higher, faster than we've been accustomed to, faster than the market thinks is going to happen. Now, I've ignored a lot of the structural factors, the $20 trillion national debt, impending insolvency of Medicare, 2028, Social Security, 2034. So the short-term outlook is pretty good. I think 2018 will be fine for the US economy. But the long-term outlook might be not so good for this country. But hopefully policymakers will make some adjustments. In any case, as I say in this final bullet, momentum should see us through 2017 and 2018. I think 2018 could be strong for the US economy, but tighter monetary policy, and by the way, we'll have a new Federal Reserve chairperson. Janet Yellen's term is ending soon, next year. Jay Powell will be her replacement, and we'll see what that looks like. But tighter monetary policy combined with a heavy dose of political intrigue could render 2018 far different from an asset price perspective, and that might set the stage for a much weaker 2019 or 2020 economically. You say, Anirban, are you saying that the next recession is coming in 2019 or 2020? That's exactly what I'm saying. Are you saying, Anirban, are you guessing? Yep, I am guessing. It's a reasonably educated guess, but I'm guessing. But that's what I see happening. It's too good to be true, these asset prices, and I think next year we start to see some adjustments, some repricing of these assets, setting the stage for something more dire, 2019 or 2020. And by the way, the next recession will be quite a weak one, not like 2008, 2009, but every recovery in American history has ended. None of them have lasted forever, and this one will end at some point as well. I'm speculating about when it will end, but that will end is almost assured. Thank you much for the opportunity to be with you tonight. It's been a privilege.